Tonight on NewsCenter. Korea marks the 56th anniversary of the 1960 pro-democracy student revolution, commemorating those who perished during the historical uprising against corruption and authoritarian rule. Korea's central bank trims its 2016 growth forecast for the economy to 2.8% from an earlier estimate of 3%. The BOK stands pat on interest rates. And death tolls climb in earthquake hit Japan and Ecuador. Hundreds of thousands living in shelters, and the first death of an evacuee blamed on prolonged evacuation. We have the latest from the disaster zones. NewsCenter begins right now. It is 9 a.m. in Washington, 2 p.m. in London, and 10 on a Tuesday night here in Seoul. Hello and welcome to our viewers all across the globe. You're watching Arirang News Center. Now, 56 years ago on this April 19th, a pro-democracy uprising broke out in Korea, one that led to a presidential resignation and a transition to the Second Republic of Korea. From President Park Geun-hye and lawmakers to the average citizens, Koreans remembered what's come to be known as April Revolution today. Our Park Ji-won takes a look at how the nation paid tribute to those who sacrificed their lives for democracy in this country.
President Park Geun-hye marked the 56th anniversary of the nation's democratic movement at 8 a.m. Tuesday morning by laying flowers at the April 19th National Cemetery in northern Seoul. The leaders of Korea's main political parties also commemorated the occasion at ceremonies later in the day. The ruling Saenuri Party's interim leader Won Yu-chul, the interim leader of the main opposition Minju Party of Korea, Kim Jong-in, and the leader of the minor liberal Justice Party all attended a ceremony at the National Cemetery held later on Tuesday morning. The co-leader of the centrist People's Party, An Chol-soo, paid tribute at a memorial in Democracy Park in southern port city of Busan. All four parties also issued special comments, praising the democracy legacy of the movement and vowing to carry on the spirit of those who led it. But the focus of the statements varied based on the party's political positions. In its statement, the conservative Saenuri Party honored the sacrifices made a half-century ago and vowed to protect and preserve the freedoms, both democratic and economic, achieved through the movement. The main opposition Minju Party of Korea said the democratic uprising showed the nation's sovereignty lies in the hands of the people. And in a reflection of the recent election, the party called on the presidential office to take a more open and conciliatory stance in its administration of state affairs. The centrist People's Party, meanwhile, criticized the current state of democracy in the country, saying it is going backward instead of progressing. It vowed to restore the democratic gains the activists of 56 years ago fought so hard to bestow on the country. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
So April 19th was commemorated by Koreans from all walks of life. But for those who lost their loved ones in the revolution 56 years ago, the day was remembered with a bit of sadness and a whole lot of pride. Our Shin Se-min has more on what's been marked as a defining moment in Korean democracy.
I was told that many people passed away on this day.
I first had it confused with other memorial dates, but I'm familiarizing myself with the April 19th Revolution Day as I pass by the cemetery.
It's a day remembered by many Koreans, a day when descendants pay tribute to those who fought for the democracy of the nation. 56 years ago, on this day, thousands of demonstrators, mostly college students, unhappy with electoral frauds and government corruption, took to the streets in Basan, Gyeongsangnam-do province, to rise against the government led by then-former President Lee Seung-man. A violent protest took place, marking the beginning of an uprising led by labor and student groups, eventually overthrowing the autocratic First Republic of South Korea under Lee. More than half a century later, There are those that remember the historic and painful moments that reshape the country's history.
For the past 2 decades, I've dropped by to visit the deceased because I've been through that time. It's just unfair.
As for those who lost a member of their family, it's a day that they don't want to think about.
He was smart. We didn't think much about the protest, and it just tears me apart every time I think of my brother and that day when he took the bullets.
The April 19th revolution is a day remembered differently by many, but against many sacrifices and pain, it marked a defining moment for democracy to flourish in Korea. 신세민, Arirang News.
The UN Security Council has expanded the list of sanctions on North Korea to include more items that could be used to develop weapons of mass destruction. Now, this comes after reports that the Sri Lankan government confiscated tens of thousands of dollars in cash from 2 North Koreans traveling through the country last month. Our Kwon Jang-ho has the latest on international efforts to curb Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions.
Marrying steel, flow-forming machines, and laser welding equipment. These are some of the new items that have been added to the UN Security Council's embargoes list concerning North Korea. Most of these items are associated with the development of nuclear weapons and missiles. For example, marrying steel is a type of reinforced steel that is used for the fuselage of planes and reportedly used on North Korean missiles. Flow-forming machines are key pieces of equipment in the production of nuclear centrifuges. A list of 14 chemicals that could be used in the production of chemical weapons has also been added to the list. These additions were added to the UN Security Council resolution that came into force at the beginning of March in response to North Korea's nuclear test and long-range missile launch earlier in the year. It also emerged on Tuesday that authorities in Sri Lanka stopped 2 North Koreans carrying $168,000 in a bag while transferring through an airport in the capital, Colombo. According to South Korea's Yonhap news agency, they were stopped on March 14th and they were traveling from Oman to Beijing. It's the first time North Koreans have been caught moving cash since the UN sanctions blocked the regime carrying out all financial transactions with other countries. The men said they were carrying wages for their colleagues who had been working in Oman. The money was confiscated and the men were fined roughly $700. The North Korean government has demanded the money to be returned, while the men are still believed to be held at a hotel near the airport. Kwon Jang-ho, Arirang News.
South Korea, in the meantime, is keeping a close eye on the North for any possible signs of an underground nuclear test. A surprise nuclear test when the world least expects. Kim Young-gil lays out the latest warning by Seoul's defense ministry.
Seoul's defense ministry says it is keeping tabs on North Korea amid signs of increased activity at the North Main Punggye-ri nuclear test site. Defense Ministry spokesperson Moon Sang-kyun on Tuesday underscored the government's concerns that North Korea could conduct a 5th nuclear test at any time and said it is hard to predict when the detonation might occur.
North Korea has the capability to conduct a 5th nuclear test at any time.
According to US-based North Korean monitoring website 38 North, a 5th nuke test by the regime cannot be ruled out since the North has demonstrated the ability to conduct detonations on short notice by slow-rolling preparations. North Korea has conducted all of its nuclear tests from the Punggye-ri site, including its 4th nuclear test in January. South Korea's Deputy Foreign Minister Kim Young-jin, who is in Washington for a seminar, said Monday that when the international community has presented a united stance on North Korea in the past, Pyongyang has made gestures toward a compromise. There are growing concerns about a 5th nuclear test after the North leader Kim Jong-un gave orders last month to test a nuclear warhead and ballistic missiles capable of carrying the nuclear warheads. Kim Young-gil, Arirang News.
South Korea, the U.S. and Japan sent out another strong message to North Korea just a few hours ago today, as senior officials from the three countries got together in Seoul for trilateral talks, focusing on the regime and its ongoing violations of UN resolutions. Our foreign affairs correspondent Kwon So-ah joins me in the studio with more. Now, So-ah, we've seen a couple of strong messages sent out to North Korea. How is this one different from previous ones? What was the core of the meeting today?
Well, for the three countries, the biggest common challenge remains North Korea. And when it comes to that front, they are on the same page, and which means they won't tolerate any more missile or nuclear provocations from North Korea. Now, South Korea's Vice Foreign Minister Im Sung-nam and his U.S. and Japanese counterparts Antony Blinken and Akitaka Saiki in their third round of talks vowed for even harsher consequences than the sanctions imposed through the latest UN Security Council's resolution.
If North Korea conducts another provocation despite the international community's repeated warnings, it will face even stronger sanctions and deeper isolation.
Now, the three sides also expressed the importance of cooperating with other countries.
We believe that China and Russia's roles are very important. We want to deepen dialogue for closer coordination.
The hopes were also expressed about eventually changing North Korea's calculus about its nuclear and missile program, but that it will take some time.
It's our sense that if we're able to sharpen the choice, there is absolutely the prospect that North Korea will make the right choice and re-engage in denuclearization. And again, what gives us a sense that that is very much possible is precisely the strength of the Security Council resolution. But it depends on implementation of the resolution. If that implementation goes forward as we expect, I think North Korea will face a very difficult choice in the weeks and months ahead. Let me emphasize something else, though.
Once again, implementation has been emphasized. So apart from the trilateral talks, I know that separate meetings, bilateral meetings between Seoul and Tokyo and Seoul and Washington were held as well today. What were those meetings all about?
Right, Kanyang. The Seoul and Tokyo talks were held prior to the three-way talks, and the Seoul-Washington talks happened after the trilateral meeting. And during the bilateral South Korea-Japan talks, the two sides not only discussed cooperation on North Korea, but Vice Foreign Minister Im Sung-nam expressed his condolences to the victims of Japan's earthquake and said the Korean government would be ready to help if needed. Now, Im and Saiki also agreed to fast-track their efforts in the implementation of last year's landmark deal between Seoul and Tokyo on Japan's wartime sexual slavery issue, including the establishment of a foundation through which the Japanese government will compensate the remaining surviving victims. Now, implementation of sanctions against North Korea were top on the agenda during Seoul-Washington talks, as well as cooperation on nuclear issues in terms of the peaceful use of nuclear energy, as the two sides held their first high-level committee recently as a follow-up to the nuclear deal, which is in effect since last year.
Now, so while the diplomats talked here in Seoul, North Korea's Foreign Minister Ri Su-yong, we're getting reports that he arrived in China earlier today, and many eyes are on that trip.
Exactly, Kanyang. He is planning to make a visit to New York, but on Friday, to attend a signing of the Paris Agreement at the UN headquarters. Of course, the Paris Agreement being on climate change. And as we learned today, as you said, he stopped by in China. However, it's unknown whether there are going to be any talks with officials there. But speculations of peace talks with the U.S. in New York are remaining, though. Now, Seoul doesn't think the talks are likely to take place, and it believes this visit is part of showing the international community that North Korea is not affected by any sanctions whatsoever.
which is contrary to various hints that we've been getting out of North Korea. A little doubtful on that front. In fact, it seems that its Workers' Party Congress will be held in a more simplistic way without foreign guests this time.
Right, Kanyang. From the outside, it doesn't really look that North Korea's economy is stable, as it often brags about. Moreover, it seems like the communist state knows it'll face more difficulties as sanctions are being followed through. Now, the ruling party's 7th Congress meeting, the first in 36 years, may not even have high-level guests from abroad. As sources say, there has been no information yet on invitations to other countries, such as China or Russia. Now, we'll probably know sooner or later, as the event is expected to take place in early May, and it looks like there are high chances it'll be on the 7th of May as of now.
The 7th of May. Lots of development to keep an eye on. Thank you, So-wa. A great coverage there.
Thank you.
Below the 3% mark, Korea's central bank has trimmed the country's growth outlook for this year to 2.8% from an earlier estimate of 3%. The new outlook further stokes concerns of Korea's falling into a low growth trap, but Bank of Korea stopped short of changing the key interest rate, holding it steady for the 10th straight month at 1.5%. An analysis into the BOK's decision today, here's our Hwang Ji-hye.
The Bank of Korea expects the country's economy to expand 2.8% this year. That's a trim from its earlier projection of 3% and signals Korea may fail to grow in the 3% range for a second straight year. After the central bank's monthly monetary policy meeting on Tuesday, BOK Governor Lee Ju-yeol explained worse than expected first quarter figures prompted by sagging global demand led to the downgrade. While the new forecast fuels concerns about Korea's feeble recovery momentum, the central bank remained cautious in maneuvering the key rate, leaving it steady at a record low of 1.5%.
There are limitations in boosting the economy just through monetary policy, because the current ailing conditions are mainly due to structural issues, not cyclical factors. So monetary policy can be effective when carried out with fiscal policies and structural reforms. The board is adamant on this.
The top central banker added, although the bank does have more room to cut its rate further, current levels are accommodative enough to support the country's growth pace. The BOK projects the Korean economy will show signs of a gradual pickup this quarter on the back of improving domestic demand. Still, market expectations linger for a trim later this year as Korea faces paltry global demand, especially from China.
With the lowered revision, we think their stance of further easing in the second half of the year actually it stays the same. We continue to believe the fiscal policy, the supplementary budget will be drawn in the later of this year, and the 2 rate cuts in the second half of the year as well.
So while the BOK kept a wait-and-see approach this month, raising questions about the effectiveness of a rate trim, analysts say if second quarter figures do not improve as expected, there will be little room for the central bank to wiggle out of easing pressure. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
It's been just over a month since the Korean government launched what's called the Individual Savings Account. It's a scheme aimed at helping customers accumulate more returns amid record low interest rates. But contrary to expectations, there's a set subscription timeframe to maintain the account, which could place a burden on middle or low-income households. The A to Z of ISA, here's our Kim Min-ji.
Over 1 trillion won, or roughly $880 billion. That's a total amount invested in a new tax-exempt individual savings account, or ISA, since its launch last month. Just 5 weeks in, over 1.5 million people have opened the accounts, more than double the figure that signed up in the first week. The ISA manages various financial products from savings to funds and stocks under one single account. Investors can customize their ISA with their own portfolios or choose one that's already been planned out by financiers. and profits they make are subject to tax exemption. For instance, account holders that earn more than $44,000 a year can enjoy tax exemptions on profits of up to roughly $1,700. If gains exceed that figure, the tax rate stands at 9.9%, still far lower than the regular rate of 15.4%. Korea is not a fast comer, though. The UK already launched the ISA system back in 1999, and every year 15 million new accounts are opened. Japan is also 2 years ahead with roughly 10% of the population holding accounts, as opening an account has been made widely simple. The UK and Japan do not have strict eligibility criteria, and they do not have a ceiling on how much profits are subject to tax exemption. But in Korea, in order to open an account, you must be an income earner. On top of that, ISA products may not be as profitable if the account holder decides to cash out before the mandatory 3-year or 5-year subscription period, as doing so means the account is no longer eligible for the lower tax rate benefit. In addition, there's the burden of commissions charged by financial institutions. Although competition is intensifying among local banks and brokerages to lure customers, experts say the ISA may not live up to its goal of accumulating more wealth for everyone, in particular middle and low-income households. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
More job opportunities for those with disabilities. Korea plans to increase employment opportunities for them by adopting a carrot-and-stick approach for employers. Our Hwang Woo-jun delves into the nation's latest policy initiative designed to improve not only the quantity but also the quality of jobs for people with disabilities.
The Korean government announced on Tuesday that it will increase its efforts to expand employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Speaking at the Seoul Customized Training Center, Prime Minister Hwang Kyo-won emphasized the importance of participation of both the government and corporations in order to improve the lives of those with special needs. One of the policies that Hwang pointed out was the Exemplary Subsidized Companies program for people with disabilities, and said the government will expand such initiative.
The Exemplary Subsidized Company program is a prototype that would increase both the quantity and quality of employment.
A fairly new concept conceived by the Employment Ministry, this is how the system works. If the parent company has a lower employment rate of people with disabilities than the minimum requirement, the government will encourage that company to establish a separate subsidiary, with the government supporting 75% of the investment, so that the company would be able to hire more people with disabilities. The catch is that the parent company must invest or own more than 50% of shares. If the parent company follows through before the end of 2016, the government will provide tax support for the next 3 years. In other words, it's a second chance for companies to hire more people with disabilities.
If companies decide not to do this, they will be fined, since they didn't meet the minimum requirements in terms of employment rate of people with disabilities in the first place.
With already 42 exemplary subsidized companies having been confirmed since 2008, the government looks to increase that number by pressuring 76 affiliated companies that have an employment rate of people with disabilities lower than 1.5% to follow the model, as the statutory minimum stands at 2.7%. Hwang Woo-jun, Arirang News.
More efforts by this country to increase employment rate and drive the economy forward. This one in the startup sector. Major financial institutions have agreed to help nurture failed startups take another shot in efforts to build a healthy startup ecosystem. Our Kim Ji-yeon has more on institutional changes being made to boost entrepreneurship here in Korea.
Failure is often seen as a mother of success, but this has not always been the case for startup founders in Korea, who have to take great risk and take that leap of faith to turn their creative ideas into real businesses. It's harder for them to start again after facing a failure, taking responsibility for the losses incurred. Also, asking for a loan with low interest may be forever lost after their first attempt, as financial institutions label them in the risky category, unable to repay the loans.
The government is trying to change the negative perception in Korean society of IT startup founders from dangerous risk takers to a bright group of innovative thinkers with potential to contribute to a budding creative economy.
The Small and Medium Business Administration, along with the Ministry of Science, ICT, and Future Planning, met up with the country's 6 major financial institutions on Tuesday to sign an agreement to help nurture restartups, or IT startups that are setting up a new company learning from their business mistakes.
Even though there are better chances for a failed startup to succeed in the next try on the back of improved business strategy and technology, the local business atmosphere is currently more favorable for startups with spotless records. So it's quite meaningful to have traditionally conservative heads of banks and financial institutions acknowledge the importance of promoting restartups.
The administrator also said the government plans to launch a nationwide campaign to support local restartups, with plans to designate Restartup Day in December so that they can come together to share their experiences and know-how. He also hopes to convene an international conference inviting globally renowned restartup founders to Korea. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Korea is preparing to shoot for the moon in 2018. As part of that plan, the country today unveiled 3 devices that it has selected to attach onto the probe. Now, each of the 3 devices are meant to carry out different tasks, but with a common goal: to collect as much information as possible about the Earth's only natural satellite. Our Oh Jung-hee has the specifics.
Korea's first space orbiter to circle around the moon. That is the grand picture Korea envisions for 2018. This orbiter came under development this year, and it'll serve to study the lunar environment, including its surface and mineral resources. In preparation for this, the Korean government selected 3 devices to be attached on the probe. The first one up is a wide-angle polarimetric camera, or POLCAM, which will observe the polarization of light coming from the moon's surface and create a wide-angle map. Adding to the anticipation of how this device will enhance the project, the POLCAM could make it possible for the first time in history to observe parts of the moon that are invisible from Earth. The second device is a magnetometer that'll measure and analyze the strength of anomalies of the moon's magnetic field. A high-definition 3D magnetic field map will be created to provide clues on the moon's formation and evolution. The final device is a gamma-ray spectrometer. It'll study the moon's geological features, such as the composition and distribution of elements on the surface, by reading gamma rays emanating from the moon's surface. Ultimately, the lunar orbiter and its 3 attached devices are meant to transmit data that can lead to finding a feasible spot for a future lunar landing. And this in turn could mark a stepping stone in Korea's first lunar exploration, which is projected to take place by 2020. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
Japan and Ecuador are both struggling to cope with the aftermath of devastating earthquakes that have claimed 47 lives in Japan and more than 400 in Ecuador. But not all victims come directly from the quakes. Prolonged evacuation for hundreds of thousands of people are taking a toll, as among the latest fatal victims in Kumamoto is a woman who died of what's called the economy class syndrome. Our Kim Jung-soo has more on that, as well as the latest out of Ecuador.
Although nearly 5 days have passed since the first quake hit Kumamoto Prefecture in southern Japan, there are still new developments rising from the affected region, as nearly 250,000 people who have been displaced from their homes face prolonged periods of time in cars, temporary tents, and other unfavorable living conditions. As of Tuesday, a 51-year-old woman from the city of Kumamoto who had been sleeping in a car died from the so-called economy class syndrome, also known as deep vein thrombosis. The syndrome, usually caused by a long instance of physical inactivity, causes blood clots in veins deep within the legs, which can then travel through the bloodstream and stop blood flow in the lungs. Japanese media outlets say that at least 23 others are suspected of suffering from this syndrome. With a substantial number of people taking refuge in their own cars, there are concerns that even more cases could appear in the future.
We want privacy, so we stay in the car, and it's better to have our family stick together. We're still a little afraid of being inside a building.
Meanwhile, a coalition of national military, police, and firefighting forces was dispatched to the area. Before the 72-hour golden window to find survivors, closed at 1 a.m. on Tuesday morning. The U.S. military provided supplementary air transportation for the recovery process, and the Kumamoto airport resumed its commercial flights on Tuesday. Over in Ecuador, rescue forces are continuing to find survivors even as casualties are mounting.
In our previous search and rescue work, we pulled 7 dead bodies from there, but we never lost hope of finding someone alive.
On Monday, a number of aftershocks struck the western side of the country. Ecuador's president said the cost of reconstruction will run to billions of US dollars. International aid has been pouring into the country, including 1 million euros from the European Union. Kim Jung-soo, Arirang News.
In New York, you're always competing for attention with something bigger, flashier, and more exciting. And the race for the White House is no different. All eyes are on the state of New York today and will be throughout Tuesday's primary, which is a crucial contest in deciding who will run for president this fall. Bruce Harrison joins me live in the studio. Now, Bruce, I've asked this before, but, the U.S. presidential race keeps on taking wild turns. Is this the primary that we will know who gets to run for the White House eventually?
Sure, Pyongyang, I think I know what you're saying. There was Super Tuesday, and then there was another Super Tuesday, another critical contest. But as you said, this race has been far from ordinary, with campaigns by non-traditional candidates dragging out their races. New York carries a lot of weight in this race, but don't expect anyone to drop out.
So what should we be watching for in the New York race tonight?
Well, the polls are a lot closer on the Democratic side, but because it's not a winner-take-all race, for delegates, Bernie Sanders needs a strong victory there to have a shot at overtaking Hillary Clinton. Splitting the delegates with Clinton in New York won't get him the nomination, and right now it looks like many New Yorkers are split on who to choose.
I love Bernie's platforms. I'm just not sure realistically if they can be applied nationwide. And I've always been a fan of Hillary's, so I'm just very torn.
Bernie Sanders.
And why?
I think he's the most in tune with the actual what the people actually want, not just what his constituents want.
On the Republican side, polls show Trump's likely to cruise to an easy victory. Many voters see New York as an opportunity for Trump and Clinton to submit their nominations.
But the fight is definitely between Trump and Hillary. They're like neck and neck. Like you can see the fists.
Clinton and Trump seem to think so too. They've increased their attacks against each other, anticipating a showdown in the general election. But more and more analysts say Trump faces a contested convention in July after a series of losses to Texas Senator Ted Cruz. At least 28 people have been killed and hundreds injured in Afghanistan in an attack claimed by the Taliban. The militant group attacked a government building in central Kabul early Tuesday with a suicide car bomber and other fighters.
They announced their spring offensive last week, and they were defeated all over the country after they carried out their attacks and have suffered lots of casualties. So by carrying this suicide attack, they wanted to take revenge.
Afghanistan's health ministry says civilians and security forces were caught in that attack.
Bruce, the Taliban's strength seems to have grown since the pullout of the international security forces. Do we expect more attacks?
Well, this is the first attack since they announced their spring offensive just last week. But in a big city like Kabul, it may be unsurprising to see more attacks because something like that really puts pressure on the shaky Afghanistan government.
Sure. All right, Bruce, thank you so much for that coverage.
My pleasure.
Well, here in Seoul, we started out the day under chilly conditions, but it was nonetheless another very nice afternoon later. But apparently we have another round of rain in store for us tomorrow. For more on that, let's go straight over to our Lee Ji-hyun at the Weather Center. Ji-hyun, it seems like we're getting frequent rain recently.
That's right, Kwon-young. But tomorrow is the day known as Gogu here in Korea. And as according to folklore, if it rains on Gogu, then we can expect an abundant year in crops.
So I suppose that's actually good news.
Right.
It's amazing how those terms match weather conditions. So give us the details of tomorrow's Kogu rain.
Sure. Well, precipitation will start tomorrow evening in some regions before spreading to entire country by Thursday morning. So for those of you in the colored regions, you need to have an umbrella handy for the evening commute. And southern coastal regions in Jeju Island will receive a heavy amount of rainfall of up to 80 millimeters, while the rest can see 10 to 60 millimeters by Thursday morning. And temperatures will be similar to today's, as daily low here in Seoul and Gwangju will kick off at 10 degrees Celsius. Busan and Jeju will start out at 12 and 13 degrees Celsius. And as for the daily highs, Seoul will get up to 19 degrees Celsius, and Busan and Jeju will see a high of 20 and 21. Now, after the rainfall on Thursday, typical spring weather will dominate the rest of the week under mostly sunny skies. Just beware of the big gaps in temperatures and dress accordingly. That's Korea for you, and here's international weather for viewers around the world.
That is our broadcast on this Tuesday night. I'm Moon Gan-young. Thank you as always for staying with us, and we hope to see you right back here same time tomorrow on News Center.